Hello, everyone. Sarah Pararia and Alex Ashmore joining you of SportyTV, joined by a very special guest. Jonathan Wilson is here from The Guardian, a football journalist who has wrote a very interesting article over the weekend. Real Madrid's toxic targeting of referees is a symbol of the Spanish Grande's decline. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Very much happy to be here.
How has the weekend been for you since releasing the article on Saturday? Have you been getting a lot of phone calls?
Yeah, I've had quite a lot of reactions. Some of it positive. The vast majority quite aggressively critical. What was interesting was I did a podcast on Friday where I criticised Barcelona, and this is not a world I normally sort of stumble into. And it's just complete coincidence. I did a Barcelona thing on Friday, a Real Madrid thing, which went out 8 p.m. Saturday night UK time. And so what's been great is I've had both sides sort of hammering me, saying, "Why do you never?" They haven't questioned any of the content of what I've written. Just why do you not talk about the other side? And so it's been this actually a fantastic marketing ploy. Actually, I have that you might be interested in this. So yeah, numbers on the podcast have been fantastic. I think the numbers on the Guardian article have been fantastic. But I don't know how people who work in Spanish journalism deal with that every weekend.
It's been quite crazy, I think, here with all the fluctuation of this season compared to last, with the performances at Real Madrid, Carlo Ancelotti under a lot of pressure, and the Spanish press, as you said in your article, I think with all the videos that Real Madrid TV have released, it's been something that's built up slowly this season. Was this an article that it was a spur of the moment, or were you, I know you said you don't really put yourself in these sort of situations a lot, but had you thought about doing something like this for a while?
My sort of way into it was really through the Super League. And it seemed to me for a long time that Florentino Perez lives in a totally different world to the rest of Europe. That a lot of what he was saying was apparently not really being challenged on, was just nonsensical. It makes no sense in the broader context of European football. So I'd had the sense of him as this sort of, on the one hand, he's the most successful football club president in history. 7 Champions Leagues on his watch. If you look at Real Madrid's revenues, they're 25% higher than Manchester City's revenues. And I think that there are certain issues with those revenues Manchester City have as the second wealthiest club in the world. So on both a financial level, success on the pitch level, he has been extraordinarily successful. And yet, there is this sense of him as this sort of fading. The term I use is from Marquez talking about Bolivar, the general in his labyrinth. This increasing paranoia as he sort of loses his grasp on the world, and the world changes, and he can't quite control it as he used to, and just at war with everybody. And it's only really this week when I started to sort of probe into it, I realized just how many different people he's at war with. And I think the referees was the thing I focused on, because we've seen a little bit of that in English football with the fans of various clubs convinced that the conspiracy is against them. I think to an extent that's a facet of social media. It's a facet of VAR, that VAR has sort of created this expectation of perfection, which of course you're never going to have. And so previously decisions went against you was that, referee, it's a hard job, they're unsighted, anybody can make a mistake. But there's this idea that, we got 30 odd cameras, how can they possibly still get this wrong? But I think this sort of practice of habitually putting out clips of decisions made by the referee you've got in the forthcoming game, highlighting decisions he's given against your club, just generates this environment where the game almost becomes impossible to referee properly. And that clearly is massively problematic, particularly given these 2 clubs, and possibly certain other ones in Europe, are essentially ungovernable, uncontrollable, because they're too big.
Yeah. I mean, one thing besides the referees, Jonathan, you wrote about in your article is the Spanish media and the coverage as well regarding this specific situation over time. And I don't know if it's the same situation that's received in the UK, because I think here in Spain it's quite obvious that there are media outlets that are, let's say, in favor for one club or the other. I think in the UK it might be a little bit more neutral, as it is in North America as well. But even now we're starting to see, as you mentioned, Marca or AS kind of also focusing on what's going on at Real Madrid now. But do you think that this has also kind of contributed to the problem over time because it hasn't been so neutral in Spain with the coverage, whether it's in favor of Barcelona or Real Madrid?
Yeah, no, I'm very conscious I'm coming at this from a British perspective, and the nature of British newspapers is very different to the media landscape in Spain, and there are very good reasons for that. I mean, very briefly, the reason that in Britain we have so many national papers is that the country is exactly the right size to make that possible. That because newspapers were growing in the 19th century, as the rail network developed, it was possible to print the newspaper in London, and you could get them to the north of Scotland, to the far southwest, down in Cornwall, overnight. So you could print it, on the Saturday evening, it'd be there on the Sunday morning. And so what happens is, rather than getting regional newspapers or rather than having regional papers that have huge power, the national papers will have the power, and they're competing with each other. It leads to our tabloid culture, which I think is problematic in many ways. It leads to sensationalism because there's a very, really from the mid-19th century onwards, there's a very intense competition between them. And so you're trying to be the most sensational, the most titillating. But what it means you don't get is a newspaper that is pro-Manchester United, pro-Liverpool, pro-Arsenal. Now, obviously, certain journalists within those papers may have their prejudices and their biases, but fundamentally, the newspapers themselves, the outlets themselves, are equally critical, equally pro, equally hostile to everybody, and that creates a different culture. I grasp that if you're a Madrid-based paper, clearly you're going to have to an extent, be pro the Madrid clubs in the way that a Manchester-based paper would be pro the Manchester clubs. But I think media has changed in alarming ways over the last 20 years or so. I think it's become increasingly siloized. I think there's a decreasing recognition of the basic role of journalism to hold people to account. And we're seeing that in Britain as well, that there's a lot of playing to the base. And that is hugely difficult and problematic. Now, I don't want to preach about Spanish media. I don't know it well enough. But it's very apparent that certain papers give certain clubs an easier ride than they possibly should.
Do you think that comes from the man you talked about earlier, Florentino Perez, and we talked about the situation this season with Vinny Jr. at the Ballon d'Or and how they supposedly were going to give the award to him, and then there was a supposed last-minute change and he didn't go, or Real Madrid didn't send anyone to the award ceremony. Do you think it all comes from Florentino Perez, or do you think there are some deeper-rooted problems here?
I think a lot of it comes from Perez. I mean, it's very difficult to know, but clearly he's a very powerful figure, and the fact he's for all but 3 years of his century he's been the president of Real Madrid. The culture of Real Madrid is a culture of Perez, and acts of petulance like not turning up to the Ballon d'Or ceremony, it's just so childish. It's so contrary to the sportsmanship that Real Madrid used to represent. That idea of seniority, which I write a lot of football history, and one of the striking things when European football is beginning is how Matt Busby, the Manchester United manager, talks of Real Madrid as they're the model to follow, not just because they've won the first 5 European Cups, but because of the way they behave. They behave with this sense of gentlemanliness, and that clearly is entirely gone. That capacity to deal with defeat, and to to accept decisions of a jury or to accept decisions of a referee, that is part of what it is to be a sporting institution, and that appears to have been lost.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that there's an argument here, and I'll play devil's advocate, Jonathan, but obviously in terms of Vinicius, he's suffered a severe amount of racial abuse here in Spain. Now, he's not the only player, but that is a big issue on its own. And he's been a big target for that. But in terms of Real Madrid and him going to the Ballon d'Or, was it necessary that he had to? I'm just trying to, change the perspective a little bit here. And I'm just wondering about some of their antics. Do you think that it's fair to say that, okay, if he wasn't going to win, does he really need to be there? Or are you sticking to the fact that it's just unsportsmanlike?
Well, I think the Ballon d'Or is a daft award. Personally, I don't care about it. If clubs want to say we just don't care, we're not going to bother with this, that I think is entirely their prerogative. The fact that they were going to go until they found out that he wasn't going to win, that strikes me as being pretty bad form. Vinicius, from what I can understand, he says that he would have gone. It was the club sort of made the decision for him. I think if you're going to take the Ballon d'Or seriously, and Real Madrid clearly do, I mean, the way they lobby for it shows how seriously they take it, then you have to accept what the vote comes up with. And to sort of say, oh, Ballon d'Or is brilliant, yeah, we take this really seriously. Oh, well, hang on, we're not winning. Oh, no, that's a silly award. We're not. You can't have it both ways. So you either celebrate it and you participate fully, or you ignore it. You don't sort of celebrate it when you win and then ignore it when you don't.
Now, Jonathan, the big news today, obviously, we've seen Trent Alexander-Arnold finally announced his move to Real Madrid. Where do you think he sits in all of this? What do you think he's thinking, looking at all of this? And for players coming to Real Madrid, what do you think they're thinking when they see all of these videos released by Real Madrid TV? In a way, is similar to the Vinny situation. Do you think that they're affected by that? And do you think they think, do I want to go to a club that has that sort of feeling in the world at the moment in terms of the criticism that Real Madrid are receiving?
I'd be fascinated to know what he actually thinks. I'd be fascinated to know how much he actually knows about that. I suspect most of what he knows about Real Madrid comes from his great mate, Jude Bellingham. So I think his view of the club will be entirely, or not entirely, but very strongly conditioned by that. So as long as Jude Bellingham's happy, I think he'll think it's a great thing. Real Madrid remain Real Madrid. They're still the most successful club in the history of the world. I can completely see the allure of playing there. I'm sure that he'll be very well remunerated for playing there. I'd be interested to see how it works tactically, because I think Alexander-Arnold is an exceptional player, but he presents certain tactical issues. You have to protect him. His passing ability is phenomenal, particularly for a defender. His capacity to take free kicks is phenomenal. He crosses the ball extremely well. I think tactically he's incredibly astute, but you have to have people who cover for him because defensively he's not the best defensive fullback. And you look at Liverpool when they were the most successful with him. He's playing on the flank with Mohamed Salah, who also doesn't do a huge amount of defensive work, but him pushing forward allows Mohamed Salah to come in field, or him drifting in field allows Mohamed Salah to stay wide. That linked up very well. But they're the best as a sort of three on that side with Jordan Henderson, who did all the running for both of them and was very adept at filling the space behind Trent Alexander-Arnold. And Real Madrid have first-hand knowledge of the defence problems that can cause, because if you think of that game in the COVID season, when Real Madrid beat them in Madrid, 2 of the goals came from Toni Kroos pinging balls precisely in that space behind Alexander-Arnold. So they've got to... He's a great talent, but he's a great talent who's not necessarily that easy to accommodate. And I don't think he's going to be a great defensive presence in the way that Dani Carvajal has been.
Just on Toni Kroos really quickly, Jonathan, you speaking about Trent kind of coming into this side, of course they're getting him on a free, but is this necessarily a player Real Madrid need right now? Do they have a tendency to kind of go for maybe the cheaper option, obviously, versus filling in the spots that they so desperately need?
I mean, I think they went through a phase of actually being very good at that. And I think the sort of rejuvenation of the squad we saw sort of towards the tail end of the Ronaldo period was, and just after he'd left, was actually very impressive. Bringing in people like Tchouaméni, Camavinga, Vinicius, Jude Bellingham. I mean, none of them were cheap, certainly when you take their wages into account, but they were players on the rise. And then they've sort of ruined that by bringing in Mbappe. And suddenly you have 3 forwards who all want to play on the left and cut in field. And we've seen the problems that causes. It's had a huge knock-on effect on Bellingham. So, I assume that's a Perez decision, and that's him sort of slightly ruining the balance of a side in the same way he did when Makelele left. Not replacing Toni Kroos and expecting Luka Modric somehow still to be able to do that at 39. That was always going to be hugely difficult. Whether they thought that Camavinga could step up and do that, but he's not really the same sort of midfielder. So, I would say their priority would be to A, to sort out the forward line, B, to find a Toni Kroos figure who can control games in the midfield. look, it'd be lovely to have Alexander-Arnold. Was he necessarily priority? Well, probably not.
Now, Jonathan, it'd be remiss of me if I didn't ask you about Negreira and the whole case that went on with Barcelona. Now, we know that there was the payments for an advisory role. From a neutral point of view, looking at how Real Madrid have behaved themselves this season with the videos and perhaps the reaction you talked about, Mourinho coming in to face up to that might of Guardiola and Barcelona, how do you think they should have reacted, or perhaps do you think there's something that they should have done leading into what they've done this season that they should have done something a little bit differently, or can you understand how they've reacted given what happened in the past with Barcelona and Negreira?
Well, I mean, that case I find just bizarre. Bizarre it was ever allowed to happen. Bizarre that nobody seems to be taking any action about it. Though we've seen in England that clubs have employed former referees to be advisors. So Nottingham Forest had Mark Clattenburg there. That seems to me odd, but kind of realistic. If you really want somebody to explain how the laws work, I'm not sure why you need it on a day-to-day basis, as Clattenburg apparently was, or a week-by-week basis. But I can understand before the season starts, you bring in a referee to explain to players, this is going to be interpreted in this way. I think the idea that you sort of isolate game by game and say this referee will penalise this, but not this, you can get away with, I think that's a very dangerous road to go down. So as a neutral, as an outsider, I find it bizarre that Barcelona are not under more pressure about this. There's not sort of talk of really quite serious sanction. But that doesn't justify in any way the way Real Madrid have responded to it. You press the issue itself. You say, how has this been allowed? Why are we permitting this to happen? You don't then compound that by putting pressure on referees this season.
Just to kind of wrap it up here, to focus on Real Madrid in this season, Jonathan, is it simply because we've seen Real Madrid and the way they've acted on the pitch this season, and they haven't gotten the results, that maybe there is so much more focus on them this season? And it seems like a lot of the media is, let's say, waking up to their antics. We've seen players like Bellingham hasn't been up to his standards. Vinny, maybe the most regressed player in football this season. Obviously, they've been hit with injuries, but the question of Ancelotti and whether he's been staying or going all season, and of course, their results, and then the behavior with De Burgos ahead of the Copa del Rey, and then, of course, the reaction after the Copa del Rey. Is it that also that they're not getting the results, but the actions on the pitch as well are finally being noticed by maybe even their fans now, and just the kind of lack of elegance in their football?
Yeah, I think the two things go hand in hand. That on all sides, that when you're getting results, A, you're less likely to transgress, and B, if you do, people are probably a bit more forgiving of it. So the two things go together, and they both ramp everything up. If they'd won that Copa del Rey, I'm sure Antonio Rudiger would not have been throwing ice at the referee. I mean, what a ludicrous sentence that even is to say. And I think a 6-game ban, I'm sorry, but that's nowhere near enough. You can't be throwing ice at a referee. The idea that somebody who's on the bench, somebody who's been substituted, is literally throwing missiles at a match official. That's not a 6-game ban. That's way worse than that. We've seen things like the Mbappe red card, that foul. The idea that's a 1-game ban. I mean, in England that's a mandatory 3-game ban straight away. I don't think it'd be increased higher than that, but it'd be 3 games. 1 game seems incredibly lax for that. But poor results on the pitch lead to poor behaviour, and they lead to greater scrutiny, and then the pressure increases, and everything is expanded off the back of that.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, it's been brilliant to speak to you, and if you guys haven't already read his article, go check it out at theguardian.com. Jonathan Wilson of The Guardian, thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you very soon.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.